Welcome to this New Scientist live stream. The human origin story is complex. As we travel through time, we'll explore how Homo sapiens ended up ruling the planet, the distant relatives who paved the way, and the cutting-edge science revealing the truth and surprising branches of our family tree. You'll hear from top experts in the field. Lee Berger, who led the team who discovered Homo Naledi, Chris Stringer, famous for his work on the Out of Africa theory and his recent work on the Denisovans, paleoanthropologist Ella Al-Shamahi, and biological anthropologist Alice Roberts. We'd love to hear your questions and comments, so be sure to pop them below. As we look around the world now, Homo sapiens, us, are the only species of human left, which begs the question, why? Why did we survive when all the others failed?
Even 100,000 years ago, there were 4 or 5 different kinds of humans around on the Earth. I would call them different species. And yet we're the only ones now. So why is that? Of course, people have different ideas about that Homo sapiens was vastly superior. And as we spread out, we simply replaced all these other species. 20 years ago, I would have said there was a big behavioural gulf between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, that we were superior to Neanderthals. And I think there's enough evidence now that the gap has considerably closed between us and Neanderthals. But if you're going to survive, you have to have enough population numbers, you have to have enough genetic diversity to see you through crises. Explaining the disappearance is not going to be due to a single cause, I don't think. Some people think language was important, and indeed we could have had a more complex language system than the Neanderthals had. I'm sure they could talk, I'm sure they had language, their lives are complex, but perhaps our language was at another level of complexity, of abstraction, of vocabulary, thinking about the deep past, thinking about the distant future, having imaginary worlds in our language. And also I think there was economic competition. So of course when we entered the territories of the Neanderthals, we're going to be hunting the same sorts of animals, collecting the same sorts of plant resources, wanting to live in the best areas, the best cave sites and so on. In their last 20,000 years, Neanderthals in Europe were probably low in numbers and low in diversity, and that was nothing to do with Homo sapiens. Things like climate change affected them, and I think it had eroded a lot of their population diversity and numbers. And so they were already in some ways perhaps a threatened species. And in that case, it wouldn't take much. A competing species collecting the same sorts of resources and eventually becoming successful. But of course, as we expand it, we've got to talk about why Denisovans disappeared, why Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, disappeared, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, perhaps Homo erectus even was still around, and they all disappeared. So it isn't even down to just us and Neanderthals. If we need a more global explanation for why we're the last ones, I think luck is certainly part of it. Developing complexity of culture in terms of our ability to use that to quickly adapt to different environments, to get into the deserts, to get into the rainforests where some of these earlier species couldn't penetrate. And also this light build we have in the skeleton, compared with these earlier species who were much more muscular. They've got a larger physiological load. They probably were more demanding of the environment in terms of the calories. And that means that in any given environment, actually you can support less people. In our case, our sophisticated culture and technology literally takes the weight off our skeletons and muscles in terms of the amount of work they have to do. And that enables us to have greater numbers in any given environment. So there was not a sudden thing which gave us our success, but I think it was cumulative. Those other species, they were successful for hundreds of thousands of years. They were certainly capable, but in the end, it wasn't enough to guarantee them evolutionary success and survival.
When we began as a species is an incredibly complex and complicated question to answer. But I would say that we have got a lot older recently than we thought. We used to think we were probably about 200,000 years old. We began probably in East Africa. Now we have managed to date some fossils in Morocco that give us a context for some other fossils in other parts of Africa that give us the impression of actually our species beginning all over Africa much earlier than we thought, at least 300,000 years ago. When it came to the routes that our ancestors, early Homo sapiens, took spreading out into the world, we now know that whatever date we suggest is the date that we arrived at X location will almost certainly not actually be the date, and it will be much, much, much earlier. We're just waiting for that discovery. It seems like our ancestors were more capable than we constantly give them credit for. And whether it's getting to Australia, whether it's getting to the Americas, whether it's leaving Africa, and whether it's getting to Europe, we are constantly finding discoveries that are challenging the dates that we put forward. There's a lot of discoveries that challenge the roots as well. The traditionally held belief 20 years ago was that it was the coastal routes, and it was always the coastal routes. And there was some that would say, no, it's an inland route. Now the understanding is that it's all of the above. If it was possible, they tended to take it. We have to be looking for those dates, but we should just be approaching it as these are the dates that we have so far, but we can pretty much guarantee that some of these dates will change and they will get earlier. We really, really still are at the early stages of understanding our history, but technology has really informed our understanding of who we are and where we come from. Everything from ancient DNA clearly helping us decipher long-lost ancestors, but also sometimes better dating. We've known about the very first Homo sapiens fossils in Morocco since the 60s, but we just didn't have dates on them. And now we have dates on them. It's like, oh, they're 300,000 years old. They're not more recent, and yet they look like that. So they clearly look like Homo sapiens, but they're so much older than we thought. You never know where the big discoveries will come from. So I think it's also just really important to be passionate about human evolution, because we just don't know what this could inform in the future.
In terms of the big picture of human evolution, no one seriously doubts that ultimately the human line begins in Africa. If we go back beyond 2 million years, there are pre-human forms which seem to have evolved into humans, and then around 2 million years ago, some of the first humans, the species Homo erectus, come out of Africa and start to spread to other parts of the world. So that's the big picture. But when we narrow it down to our own species, Homo sapiens, the pictures become more complex as we've learnt about Neanderthals and our interbreeding with Neanderthals, as we've learnt about these people in the Far East called the Denisovans. And even when we had a common ancestor with the Neanderthals is no longer looking as straightforward as I used to think. So we've got a recent Homo sapiens skull there, the white one. We've got a Neanderthal there next to it, opposite. And when we look at the end products of those evolutionary lines, we can see they're very distinct. So for Homo sapiens, we've got a high and rounded brain case. We've got small brow ridges, a small face tucked under the brain case. We've got small teeth, we've got a chin on the lower jaw. If we could look inside the temporal bones at the sides, at the ear bones, we would see that they're distinct from those of Neanderthals. And if we turn to the Neanderthals as the end product of that line, we can see that they have their own distinctive features. A longer lower skull, big brow ridge over the eyes, the face pulled forwards, this great big nose dominating that face and the cheekbones swept back. If we had the jawbone, not much of a chin on that jawbone, relatively big front teeth, and again, the ear bones distinct from those of Homo sapiens. So as those terminal members, we can see they're clearly different. But as we trace back in time, of course, we're approaching a time when they must have had a common ancestor. And geneticists estimate that that common ancestor lived maybe 600,000 years ago. And if we look at the fossils and try and match that, I used to believe, and some people still do believe, that a species called Homo heidelbergensis was the common ancestor of us and the Neanderthals. But there are problems with that now. So more work on heidelbergensis suggests that, first of all, it has its own distinctive characteristics, which makes it less likely to be a common ancestor for the Neanderthals and us. And also, some of the heidelbergensis fossils are simply too young to represent those ancestors. So this fossil, this is a replica of the fossil from Broken Hill Kabwe in Zambia. And people used to think it was about 500,000 years old. We now know it's about 300,000 years old. And that means it's actually contemporary with members of the Neanderthal lineage. In fact, it's a bit younger than this one from the Cima de los Huesos at Atapuerca, which is probably 400,000 years old. And It's also about the same age as this fossil from Jebel Ihud in Morocco, which we think is about 300,000 years old and which many people, including me, put on the Homo sapiens lineage. So Heidelbergensis becomes a less likely ancestor, and work I've been involved in with Chinese colleagues suggests that actually the lineage may go back even further. The separation may go back even further, towards 1 million years. So if we move the common ancestor back towards 1 million years, we have fossils, for example, like this one from China, from Yunxian. That could be close to the common ancestor. There are fossils in Europe, such as the Homo antecessor fossils from Spain. And in Africa, there are fossils such as the ones from Buea in Eritrea. So it's much more complicated now to say when was that common ancestor. And if we look along the sapiens lineage, we also see there's lots of diversity. So it's not easy to sort of just make a cut-off point when we can say this is Homo sapiens. We can say that recent Homo sapiens is of course us, that's our species. This fossil from Israel, about 100,000 years old, from Kafse, I think that has pretty well all of the Homo sapiens features. So I'm happy to call that Homo sapiens at 100,000 years. We've got this fossil, and this is only part of it, from Homo kibish in Ethiopia. It's around 200,000 years old. And the bits preserved show that the brain case is high and rounded. It's got a small brow ridge. We've got other parts represented. There's a chin on the lower jaw. There's a skeleton, which is lightly built and has a narrow pelvis, which is another Homo sapiens feature. So I'd be happy to put that into Homo sapiens. But the trouble is, you know, at around the same date, as far as we can tell, at Homo kibish, there's this other fossil. Homo 2, it's called, Homo kibish 2, and it's much less like recent Homo sapiens. Yes, it's got a small brow ridge, yes, it's quite high, but it's got a strongly angled back, like Heidelbergensis and some other more primitive humans, and overall, to me, that doesn't fit into the Homo sapiens category as well as these later ones. So you can see we've got a problem straight away, and with Jebel Ihud at around 300,000 years, yes, the face looks like a bigger version of ours, so we'd say yes, that looks like Homo sapiens. Some of the teeth have Homo sapiens features. There are lower jaws with Homo sapiens features. But the shape of the brain case is long and low, like a Neanderthal, like to some extent Heidelbergensis. So this is a more primitive brain case shape. So it brings to light the problems of looking at evolution along a lineage. These features don't all evolve at once. They evolve gradually. At times there were populations that were separate, and they evolved separately for periods of time. Then when the climate improved, they spread out, contacted each other, exchanged genes and ideas, and mixed a bit. And potentially, in Africa, there were different populations around at the same time, showing different mixes of more primitive and more derived features, as we can see in these two specimens from Homo kibish. One looks much more sapiens-like at 200,000 years than the other one. It won't be necessarily a simple story because of this more complex web of populations that eventually converged, if you like, to make what we call Homo sapiens today.
Now it's time to move right back along the timeline, digging into the deep roots of our family tree. Millions of years ago, these hominins set the stage for everything that followed. And one discovery, 50 years ago, shone a light on our ancestors.
In 1974, I was very fortunate to discover a partial skeleton, popularly known as Lucy, and she's 3.2 million years old and one of the important fossils in our very ancient ancestry. This area where she was found is known as the Afar region, named after the local tribal people, the Afar people, in Ethiopia. It was terra incognita when I began working there in 1972. And at that time, 3 million years was a real barrier. If you look beyond 3 million years, you'd find literally a handful of fossils. We really didn't know who those very ancient ancestors were. I don't think I really understood the impact it would have. We knew that it was a extraordinary find. We're happy when we find, you know, a little piece of jaw or part of a skull or whatever. But here you had parts of a skull, you had a complete lower jaw, you had parts of arms, parts of the rib cage, parts of the backbone, a fairly complete pelvis, and a tibia or a shin bone. We knew that just because it was so complete, it was important. But I didn't realize that it would actually launch a new species until 1978, when it was announced as Australopithecus afarensis. Here is the knee joint I found, and it's identical. This is the bottom end of the thigh bone, and this is the top end of the shin bone. And this is identical to the knees that an orthopedic surgeon puts in as a transplant. And one of the first people I showed this to was an orthopedic surgeon. And he looked at it and he says, well, it's identical to a modern human knee. So that meant certainly that this creature was bipedal, upright walking. There aren't many bipeds on this planet, but certainly with 8 billion of us on the planet, it's been very successful. And all of the hallmarks, all of the anatomy of that bone suggested beyond doubt that that creature was walking upright. So this was a human ancestor. She was given a name, Lucy, as I said. We were listening to a Beatles tape the night of discovery. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was the song playing, and I thought she was a female because she was so small. And so she was reconstructed as being about 3.5 feet tall, which was very short. And the question was she a child? Well, we know from the lower jaw that the third molars are erupted. Details of the teeth in where my finger is pointing, particularly this, what our dentists call the bicuspid, are features. It's oval shape. It has only a single cusp. Those features are very ape-like, and we had never seen that in other jaws of Australopithecus. This is an early reconstruction of her cranium. We now have complete skulls. All the black here is reconstructed, but it pretty much is identical to the more recent discoveries of a male and a female skull. And it's quite ape-like, with this very low forehead, and most obvious is this very projecting face. Darwin and Huxley wrote about these things. They suggested that the deeper we go into prehistory, if we indeed did have, as they proposed correctly, a common ancestry with the African apes, we would look more ape-like. So that confirms, to a large extent, what they were suggesting. And the fact that they suggested that if they are more ape-like and more similar to the African apes, that the oldest ancestors would in fact be found in Africa. And of course, that's the case. During the first half of the 20th century, there was a major debate among anthropologists as to whether or not we stood up first and then brains grew, or we had larger brains and then moved out of the forest onto the savannas and then began walking upright. And this shows us very clearly that upright bipedalism, upright walking, precedes brain expansion. And in fact, there are some specimens from Kenya that take us back to 6 million years, and those leg bones appear to have been from an individual who walked upright. So you had quite a long period of upright walking before you had significant brain growth. Not that bigger brains are more intelligent, but certainly with more neural connections and so on, you become a more creative species. I didn't know the impact it would have not just on the science. We've just had a celebration at the Institute of Human Origins where scholars came from around the world, and whether they were studying teeth or studying locomotion or studying brain size or whatever, they presented papers showing how that discovery influenced the trajectory of their research. I traveled back to Ethiopia in January to visit research going on at Hadar, where Lucy was found, and we all went and visited the exact spot where I found her on that Sunday morning. And I found her because I looked over my right shoulder and recognized a little bit of arm bone. And the thought that went through my mind was, if I'd looked to my left, I would have missed her. And my life would have been incredibly different.
From these early ancestors, we jump millions of years forward to one of the most controversial and astonishing discoveries of the 21st century. Homo naledi sent shockwaves through science, shaking our family tree and destabilizing pretty much everything we thought we knew. This next talk by Lee Berger tells the tale of the discovery.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. And thank you for the great English weather greeting. I was hoping for something a bit sunnier. Today I'm going to take you through an extraordinary story, a tale of exploration and discovery. In one of the fields of sciences, this is probably one of the most difficult sciences in the world. This field of science, paleoanthropology, the search for human origins, when I first entered it in 1989, you had less than a 1% chance of actually discovering a single remain of an ancient human during your entire career. Can you imagine the type of people who go into a science with that kind of odds against them in discovery? Another statistic at that time was that there were actually more scientists studying these remains than there were actual fossil remains of ancient human relatives. That made it a rather competitive sport. And so when I started into this field in the late 80s, I wanted to go to East Africa because all the discoveries were coming from East Africa. That was the place, it was even the East Side story of human origins. I quickly found out, though, at the advice of Richard Leakey and Don Johansen, that there was going to be very little room for a young paleoanthropologist who wanted to discover fossils in East Africa. And so I decided to journey to South Africa. In fact, South Africa had been the birthplace of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa way back in 1924 when Raymond Dart had discovered the Tongchal. But since 1948, the field had stagnated. There had been no new sites discovered. The only fossils that were being discovered were from traditional known sites. But I threw myself into looking for new fossil sites. And within just a few months of arriving in South Africa, I won the paleoanthropological lottery. At a site called Gladysville, just outside of Johannesburg, I found 2 hominid teeth. Now, I know that doesn't sound a lot to all of you, but to give you an idea of the scarcity of ancient human relative fossils, those 2 hominid teeth made National Geographic magazine, the first new hominid site in subequatorial Africa in 48 years. I threw myself into that site, knowing that the next rock I turned over, the next brushstroke was going to reveal that half of a mandible or jawbone that was going to make my career, and I could dine out at cocktail parties, at conferences for the rest of my life. It didn't happen. 17 years would go by without a major discovery. Oh, I was having a fine career. I was advancing through the normal ranks of paleoanthropology. But by the late 90s, I began to hear at conferences, wow, I've never seen someone go so far on 2 teeth. That was not a compliment. In 2007, I found myself in an unusual position. The world had changed around me. Paleoanthropology had convinced itself that there were no new great fossils to discover. Scientists even published that there were going to be no major alterations in the way we view human evolution, that all the major fossil fields had already been discovered. And the only way forward was to invest in technology into the fossils that we'd already discovered. And so I found myself, who had built an exploration sort of unit at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, in the invidious position of actually serving on a committee to replace myself with a new director who would take us in the direction of technology, using the new computers that were appearing, that could process big data sets, that could actually examine these fossils that already existed, things like geometric morphometrics, and handle large CT data. That was what was getting on the cover of journals like Nature and Science. And so I found myself in December of 2007, sitting at home, pondering where life was going to take me. What was I going to do for the next stage of my career? And like most people who are soul searching, I was surfing the internet for that answer. And it was at that moment that I became the last human being on Earth to discover Google Earth. There it was, free satellite data. And I stared at this going, my gosh, that's amazing, because back in the late 90s, I had won a grant from National Geographic to do something extraordinary and difficult, to combine technology, then available NASA satellite data, with that amazing brand new technology, handheld GPS. And I knew there was a way of bringing those two things together, I was certain of it, to find sites that might have great fossils in them. And I'd spent 3 years of my life collecting data. And here was a free way to test that data. I found that little white box up in the corner. I typed in those coordinates. The first ones I typed in were Gladysville, because I knew that site better than anyone on Earth. And up it went into space, and down it came on absolutely nothing. The next one I put in, same thing. Didn't mark a site at all. Third, fourth one. It didn't take me long to Google to find out why, of course. The US government had owned those satellites in the late 90s. And they had actually put deliberate error into them so they couldn't be used for acts of terrorism and other things. And that deliberate error, combined with the primitive nature of the then handheld GPSs, had created a sort of a compounding error. I'd wasted 3 years of my life. I was sad. But as I stared at that screen, I began to see that I could see the sites that I'd intended to map. And so instead of making a sort of pathetic phone call to National Geographic, I began moving the dots from the wrong place to the right place. And in the process of that, I began to learn what a cave site and what a fossil site looked like from outer space. It was teaching me this error that had occurred. And it also began to make me think, wow, it looks like there might be others out there. But I knew that was impossible. This region just outside of Johannesburg is perhaps the most explored area on planet Earth for sites like this, for these fossils. It's been explored continuously by every major scientist in the field since the mid-1930s. But it was convincing enough that by March of 2008, I'd created a sort of map of where I thought there might be some more fossils. And I, of course, went, because it's human nature, as far away from Gladysville as I could possibly get. I went about 25 kilometers away to the edge of those Dolomites, because this was an unexplored area. That's where new discoveries were going to be made. And on the very first day out, with my dog towel and a laptop and a 3G card, I found 21 new localities. Now, to put that in perspective, in the previous sort of 70, 80, 90 years, there'd only been about 130 total cave sites found and 18 fossil-bearing sites in that region. And on day one, I found 21 new ones. I was addicted. I started throwing myself into this journey of searching for new sites. I became a professor in absentia at WITS because it was addictive, because every time I went out, I'd find more. I'd spend the night making targets, go into the field the next day, and I would find more. It was extraordinary. So extraordinary that by July, I'd found over 750 new localities and almost 70 new fossil sites that no one had ever seen before. By that time, I'd kind of finished the area, and I'd moved back into the area around Gladysville. I'm doing that last because I knew there was nothing there to find. I'd spent 17 years digging at that site. I knew that area better than any human being on Earth. And on that day, on August 1st, 2008, I went to an area that had some trees and targets that looked promising, 1 kilometer away from Gladysville. And there I saw this hole in the ground, a tiny little hole. It didn't look anything like the kind of sites that we actually found fossils in that area typically. The big sites that produce hominids were gigantic sites, full of thousands of fossils, because your odds are so low. But the very first rock I turned over at this site had a fossil in it, a fossil antelope. That didn't excite me very much, because let me give you a little statistic. By that time, I'd done some calculations to tell us that for every one fragment of an ancient human relative that we discover, we would find about 250,000 antelope fossils. And I just found another one. This had been the story of my life at Gladysville for 17 years. But I was on a mapping mission that day, so I just took notes, took a photograph, and then walked up the hill and found 47 previously unidentified sites, 1 kilometer from where I'd spent a big chunk of my life looking. That bothered me a little bit. I went back to the lab, and I didn't tell you this, but we'd had a terrible tragedy. The young person that we had selected to replace me and to build this new technological era, this new technological department at Wits University, was actually killed in a motorcycle accident here in London. And so we'd already built these labs, we'd brought in postdocs. These people are rare and precious, these experts in these fields. And so a young postdoc who was now without a mentor came into my office, Job Kibbe, a Kenyan. And he said, "Would you be my postdoctoral supervisor?" And I said to him, "No." I wasn't being cruel. But I said, "Job, you're a lab guy. I'm a field guy, but I've just found this site. And if you're interested in maybe learning how to be a field guy, it intrigues me. Let's go out and look at it." And so on August the 15th, 2008, Job and I and my then 9-year-old son Matthew, my dog Tao, went out to the site and started walking up to it. I told them the story of discovery. And there we were standing right about where this picture was taken. I said, "Okay, guys, go find fossils." They were all around us in the rocks. And with that, Matthew and Tao take off. This is in a gigantic game reserve. There are antelopes, leopards, zebra. I thought they're off chasing those. I'll see them at lunchtime. And I turned to Job and I said, "I wonder why this had been left by miners." Because miners had worked this area for lime, and they clearly found this place. There were a couple of blast holes. That was the rock I'd found was a loose one from blasting. But they left it alone very quickly. And as I finished saying that, Matthew said, "Dad, I found a fossil." There I could see him, 15 meters off the site. There shouldn't be any fossils there. But, because like all of you want to encourage fossil hunting, I had to go over and see what he found. And so I started walking towards him. And 5 meters away, I knew his and my life were going to change. Because sticking out the side of that rock that he's holding was a hominid clavicle. That's his collarbone, the curved bone here. I knew it from 5 meters away because serendipitously, I was probably the world's expert, maybe the world's only expert on hominid clavicles at that moment. I'd done my PhD on them, all 6 fragments. As I took the rock from Matthew, he claims I cursed. I don't believe that. I was looking at this and doing what anyone would do. What else can this be? This can't be a hominid clavicle that I studied for my PhD. And I turned the rock over, and there on the back was a jawbone and a hominid canine and multiple parts of a hominid skeleton. Matthew had not just found a clavicle. He'd found one of the rarest things in all of history, a partial skeleton of a hominid. And let me say that us paleoanthropologists are very generous with that term. We call any part of the head associated with any part of the body of a single individual a partial skeleton. And at that time in history, there were approximately 7 known. You would have heard of some like Lucy, Turkana Boy, Littlefoot. The others are so fragmentary they have numbers. Matthew had found one, and it would turn out to be extraordinary. The preservation of the fossils from this site that we would call Malapa would be extraordinary and unprecedented. The fossil that Matthew had found was part of a little boy that was probably between about 7 and 9 years old when he died 2 million years ago. He was only one of a large number of skeletons that we'd find. The Malapa site would be the first site on the continent of Africa where we would find multiple skeletons together. First one, then 2 weeks later I would find a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth, then a sixth. It very quickly became one of the richest sites in the world. We were living the scientific dream. My colleagues and I had won the scientific lottery. Billions of odds chance to win. And there it was. And we had a brand new species, something no one had ever seen before that we would call Australopithecus sediba. We lived the scientific dream. 3 special editions of the journal Science. And for those of you who aren't academics, to get your fossil on the cover of the journal Science or Nature is like, a rock star being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. It's like what you live for. It was all over the world. Dozens of scientific papers were produced. My project grew from 1 scientist to 100 over a period of 3 years. We started discovering things at this little site that we had never seen before. Organic remains were preserved 2 million years. We found skin. We found hair attached to even the hominids themselves. It was amazing, but it was so amazing that we had to do something different. I had to design a laboratory to build over the top of that fossil deposit. And so, for a period in 2013, I was locked out of the site. We could not continue excavations. And so, I stepped back and I realized I'd made a mistake. I'd not been exploring since Matthew had said, "Dad, I found a fossil." And I had this list then of almost 800 localities. And all those localities are not just points on a map. They're not just sites like Malapa. A huge majority of them are doorways into an underworld. Because when I look at this landscape where these discoveries are made, I see something different than maybe you do. You maybe see a rolling, beautiful savanna grassland. What I see is a gigantic block of Swiss cheese. Because underneath this dolomitic limestone are caves, kilometers and kilometers of them. But they had hardly been explored, and certainly no one had a map like I did. There was a reason, though, that people didn't spend a lot of time in the deep underground. There was an idea, almost a mythology, almost a truism at that time, that the things underground were going to be young and worthless. These were modern caves. What you wanted was caves like Malapa on the surface. Those were the ancient caves that Earth had eroded down to. But I also didn't have any resources or facilities to actually explore these caves at that moment. And that's when another serendipitous moment happened. A pirate walked into my office. Wasn't a real pirate, but he kind of looked like him. Pedro Boshoff, a former student of mine back in the 1990s who had vanished to go diamond hunting in Central Africa and had failed. And there he was back in my office saying he'd made a terrible mistake in leaving paleoanthropology. He loved it, and he wanted to get back in. And why it was serendipitous was because Pedro had been a caving buddy of mine back in the 1990s. He was an expert caver. So I said, "I've got a job for you. I want you to go explore this map, but I want you to start in places that we think we know the best. Places like the Sterkfontein Valley, which had been excavated continuously since the 1930s. Places like Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, because I found new caves there, and I'd learned a lesson from Malapa, that sometimes you don't see the things you are most familiar with. Backyard syndrome can occur." And so off he went, and the greatest miracle of any of these stories I'm going to tell you actually occurred. The university allowed me to buy a motorcycle for him, and anyone who's worked with a university would understand why that's a miracle. And off he went and quickly came back. Because Pedro found out that he was no longer physiologically appropriate to get into many of these cave systems. What that means is he's a little bit too fat to get into these narrow spaces. And so we discussed and decided to enlist two amateur cavers, Rick Hunter and Steve Tucker. I have to digress for a moment and tell you, Rick Hunter was a nearly unemployed part-time construction worker who had been thrown out of high school after blowing up his high school chemistry lab, and he was a member of Mensa. And Steve Tucker was an accountant by day, but an amateur caver by night, and they were very physiologically appropriate. And so off they went. And they went into the Sterkfontein Valley as told, and I would hear from them once a week or so, and they weren't finding much at all the new sites I discovered, because like any human, they went after the new first. That's where the good discoveries are going to be made, right? In the places we haven't been before. They finished that area except for one cave site, an enormous one called the Rising Star Cave System. And the reason they did that last was because they knew, as I did, there would be nothing in there. The Rising Star Cave System is perhaps one of the best known and best explored cave sites, maybe on the continent of Africa. Every amateur caver in the region of Joburg and in South Africa has at some point trained in there. It was completely mapped. But they were being dutiful, and off they went in exploration, and they went into a chamber called Dragon's Back one evening, September 13th. Exploring after 4.5 hours, they found a crag of rock that went up, and that's why the chamber's named Dragon's Back. It looked like the scales on a mythical dragon going up. Imagine they're 40 meters below Earth. This thing ascends up 20 meters, and up they go, and at the top of it, they see a little crack, 7.5 inches wide. And they look down this crack, and then they slide into the crack, and they realize it continues downward. And so, because they're my kind of crazy, down they went. 12 meters down, skinnying in so much that if they even inhaled, they actually would stop. And fortunately, at the bottom, that chute didn't open up into a large cavern and they fell to their deaths. Otherwise, this would be a very short story. But they dropped into a relatively small chamber. And then after passing through a long, narrow passage, they saw bones on the ground. Now, they were a long way back in the system. There should not be bones on the ground. And so they began looking at them, and they thought they might be interesting. But they weren't sure. Remember, they were amateurs. They weren't experts. They pulled their camera out, and it didn't work. It had been damaged by the humidity. And so out they came, and luckily they could get out, traveling back that 4.5-hour road. They called Pedro, said they thought they might have found something interesting. And he called me the next morning, and I said, look, send me pictures, because I hear that type of thing all the time, and usually someone's found, a plastic baby doll head in their backyard, and it's nothing important. And I promptly forgot about it. Until October 1st at 9 o'clock in the evening, when my front gate buzzer buzzed. And in Johannesburg at 9 o'clock in the evening, people don't randomly buzz your front gate buzzers. And I answered it, and someone said, "You're going to want to let us in a creepy voice, just like that. It was Pedro with Steve. After considering my options for a little bit, I eventually did let them in. Steve opened up his laptop, and I saw a picture like I never thought I would see in my entire life. You are allowed to gasp when you see these things. That was a hominid mandible. And it was just lying there on dirt. I'd never seen anything like that in southern Africa. You remember that beautiful skull that Matthew had found? To get to that condition had taken 22,000 person preparation hours. It was encased in solid concrete. This is just lying there. I could tell it was primitive. I could see by the shape of the teeth. The next slide they showed me showed parts of a skeleton. I was looking at a potentially primitive hominid skeleton lying on the floor of a cave, and then I saw this, and you have to gasp when you see that. That is a skull. It's a skull. I was blown away. This was like nothing I'd ever seen. We celebrated. I sent them on their way. Couldn't sleep. 2 a.m., I decided to make a phone call. I decided to phone a friend. I phoned Terry Garcia, head of missions at National Geographic. And even though he had caller ID, he answered his phone. And I said, Terry, I've got something. And I explained to him the story. I sent him a couple of these pictures. And then I said, if you are ever going to trust me right now. That's just explorer speak for I need money. Terry paused for a moment and said, okay, Lee, do what you need to do. That's grant agency speak for, don't spend too much money and don't embarrass us. I hung up the phone and immediately got cold feet. Here I had just risked the entire reputation of my gigantic team with its great record on some pictures taken by amateurs in a place that I could never go and check. But I did have someone I trusted who I thought could get down a 7.5-inch, 12-meter chute. My then 15-year-old, 6'4", but very skinny son, Matthew. And so the next weekend, out we went to Rising Star, crawling through all these horrible spaces, way back into this cave, over 150 meters back in, climbing up Dragon's Back, where if you fall off, you die, getting to this little narrow thing, and down Matthew went with Rick and Steve, because I guess I'm going for Father of the Year. And I sat there in the dark at the top, shutting off my light to conserve batteries, looking at this impossible situation. What was I going to do if this was real? How would I do this? I began to build an idea of doing it like you did a deep sea discovery, like the way my colleague James Cameron or Bob Ballard explores undersea. I could see remote cablings, a command center with cameras and audio and such like that, but who was I going to get in there to do this in this incredibly dangerous space? And then I heard scrabbling, and Matthew came back up. His head pops out of the hole, and because I'm going for Father of the Year, I didn't say, are you okay? I went, and? And he handed me the camera, and he said, Dad, it was beautiful. He said, my hands were shaking for 3 minutes before I could take the first picture. And it was extraordinary. It was truly extraordinary, for there was that skull. It was real, but it also disturbed me. Because do you see all those little white bits up there? Those white bits are broken bone. And Steve and Rick and Matthew swore that they had not stepped on this. Someone had been in that chamber and stepped on some of this material. And I didn't know how recently. And so I went home, and that Sunday I was pondering, how am I going to find people to do this? I mean, I have colleagues and stuff, but this is going to take not only people with PhDs and stuff that can actually work on potentially some of the most precious material, but they have to fit. And so I did what anyone would do in that circumstance. I put a Facebook ad out. Now, you don't have to read the Facebook ad. Basically says I need skinny scientists. I need skinny scientists who will drop everything, come to Johannesburg within the next 3 weeks. I'm going to launch an expedition. I'm not going to pay you, but I will feed you, and I'm going to risk your life. And I sent that off thinking there would probably be, 5 or 6 people qualified to do this in the world. Caving desirable. Within 10 days, I had almost 60 qualified applicants. Over 80% of them were young women. From that extraordinary group of applicants, I shortlisted and picked 6 of them that just happened to be young women. And on November the 7th, we put a 60-person expedition into the field. A 60-person expedition that laid 3.5 kilometers of cabling, built command centers, built caving tents, built a science tent, all to recover this, all the safety procedures in place. And on November the 10th, we watched with trepidation as the first ones entered. The first scientist entered the cave, being led by Matthew who would show them where the material was on the ground. We had brought in new technology. And I was watching images like this, and I was watching images like this. And we also decided at that moment to bring this to the world. And so we went live on the internet. And by the end of this expedition, I'll tell you, we had over 1 million followers watching this, because I thought this was maybe the first and possibly last time in history anyone would ever see a fossil hominid being discovered, because these are the rarest sought after objects on the planet. And during one of the blog sessions with National Geographic, I made a grave mistake. Someone said, "What is it like to watch them? What are these people like?" And I said, "They're like astronauts." I would see them disappear in their kit, and then they would appear in black and white on these thermal cameras, and they would journey into this remote place where I can never be. But they're like underground astronauts. Oh, I wish I'd never said that. The hate mail I have received in the last years of they're not astronauts, they're speleonauts, or they're troglonauts, or what, I apologize. But it happened, and it took off. And they were extraordinary and brave. And they were applying technologies that had never been applied before. White light scanners, 3D mapping of this, because everything we had to do had to fit through 7-inch slot. And it had to be rugged enough to work in this 100% humidity environment underground. By the second day, we knew I was wrong. It was not a hominid skeleton. It was more than one hominid skeleton. We had 3 right femurs, and there are no human relatives with 3 right legs. By the end of the week, we knew that something extraordinary was happening. We had found more individual hominid remains than any other site in the history of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa. It was palpable, the excitement. We knew that this was, for paleoanthropology, our Howard Carter moment. You can probably see it on the expressions of their faces that this was a great moment of discovery. And it kept getting better. It also was very confusing because they were only bringing hominid fossils up. And I began to be suspicious that they were sort of cherry picking down there. And they assured me they were not. There were only hominid fossils in this remarkable chamber. We started working from 6 a.m. into the evening, often finishing at 6 or 7 in the evening. Actually not on purpose, though. Because you see, we were working in shifts, and I would send that last shift in usually about 2 o'clock in the afternoon with the idea of them coming out at 5 because they're working in these cramped conditions, in this tiny spaces, very dangerous, very difficult, very stressful. And usually about 4:30, I'd say, "Okay, guys, start packing it up." And they'd say, just a minute, we're just getting this last one. By 5:30, I'd be, "All right, it's really time to come up." And, they'd be, "Oh, we're almost done with this. It's just coming up in a moment." By 6 o'clock or 6:30, I'd be, "Okay, it's time to finish." And they'd say, "Come and get us." And that wasn't going to happen. It was an extraordinary moment of science. By the end of the expedition, we had discovered more fossil hominid remains than in the entire history of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa. A 3.5-week expedition designed to find one skeleton. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment because many people think I'm exaggerating when I talk about the dangers of this. And just because we haven't killed anyone speaks more to actually our safety procedures and protocols than it does this. I'll show you the kind of journey to the cave and chamber. This is one of the easy parts. We call this Superman crawl for obvious reasons because you extend your arm above your head to fit through. This is nothing. Rick is going through now. I can get through that. This is about halfway there. And these remarkable scientists and technicians and cavers and safety cavers were making that journey back and forth up to 9 times a day. A 240-meter journey that would take about 45 minutes for an experienced caver. And that's all before descending that chute. From this point on, they journey through some other squeezes, they climb Dragon's Back, and there at the top, they have to take the journey down that chute. Now, I'm using this picture for a very deliberate reason. I want you to understand that I am an equal opportunity child abuser. That's my daughter Megan up there. She would sit at the top of the chute in a position we called chute troll, mining the communication link between us and the command center and down below, 15 meters down below her with the people excavating the caves. And she would go up and down that chute as many as 10 times a day in order to carry fossils up because it was too narrow to even put equipment in. Do you want to see what it's like inside of that chute? The claustrophobe should probably look away at this moment. This is what happens as you drop out of that chute into the chamber below. That's you've been doing for the previous 12 meters, all the way down. And he's still smiling. This chamber was remarkable. We would name the chamber the Naledi chamber in tribute to the rising star cave system. Naledi in the Sutu language means chamber of stars. And as I said, at the end of the expedition, it had instantly become the richest fossil hominid site discovered in all of history on the continent of Africa, perhaps in the world. We'd recovered well over 1,500 individual remains, representing at least 15 individuals, from a surface collection and a 1 meter by 1 meter by 20 centimeter deep excavation. The floor appeared to be literally made of these fossils, and they were truly extraordinary. It was a strange looking creature. It had a flat face. It had a tiny brain that we could measure at about 450 to 500 cubic centimeters. We seemed to have males, which were heavily built, and females that were lighter built, but they were very close in size, much like human sexual dimorphism is. We had many individuals beautifully preserved in dentition, almost 200 individual teeth from this area. We had beautifully articulated remains, like this foot, which was one of 6 feet. Almost everything we had was the most complete that had ever been found in the entire fossil hominid record. We had the most complete hands ever found, all 8 of them that were recovered. And this is just a tiny percentage of this remarkable sample that had come out of this chamber. Well, how do you study a sample this large in a field that had previously been confined to scraps, where I myself had done my entire PhD on the shoulder girdle of hominids on 13 fragments from across the continent? And so we again went to social media and to our colleagues, and we found a nest of early career scientists, the best and brightest, with data sets that they were willing to share in an open way, something not traditional in paleoanthropology. Over 40 scientists that we brought together in Johannesburg from all over the world, including some of the members of the Sediba team, because they were already world experts in analyzing skeletons, and we went to work on that. And in the end, we described an extraordinary creature, a new species, another one, to science. Except this one was in our genus, we were certain. We would call it Homo naledi, and it truly was a mystery to behold. It had a tiny brain, about the third the size of modern human brains that you can see imposed in the background. It had bizarre ape-like shoulders, in fact, almost gibbon-like shoulders. It had a chest like an ape, a spine that was tiny but resembled in some ways Neanderthal spines. As you went down its arms became more and more and more human-like until you hit that hand, which was incredibly human-like in the wrist and almost superhuman in the proportions. The thumb was elongated, but the fingers were curved. Curved like the most primitive ancient human relatives we had that dated to 4 or 5 million years old. The legs were equally bizarre. From a primitive pelvis, they were primitive at the top and became more and more advanced, more human-like until you reach those feet, which were the most human-like that anyone had ever seen outside of humans. We would call this species Homo naledi. Naledi means star in the Sutu language. And there you can see it, there over on the right-hand side. A strange, skinny, elongated, almost pin-headed creature that shared many things with us and many things we haven't seen. It looked like one of the most primitive members of our genus. It was more primitive than Homo erectus, who you see in the middle there, but less primitive than Australopithecines like Lucy, who you see there. A strange mosaic. It seemed to say that maybe human origins hadn't happened the way we thought. Was this a replacement for Homo habilis, the roots of our genus? We knew more about this species because we had everything from infants to the elderly. Over 15 individuals had every bone represented except the hyoid in the throat multiple times. but we didn't know how old it was. When we published it, many of our colleagues told us how old it was. They said that it's primitive. It's got to be at least 2 to 3 million years old. And we said, we don't know. It's just lying here on the floor of the cave. And of course, it's sitting here in this chamber that's almost impossible to get to. And through all of our research, we cannot find another entrance. They appear to have been using the same chute we use to get in. And so when we published Homo naledi, we came out with a hugely controversial hypothesis. We said there is only one reason we can think of why there would be only Homo naledi inside of this chamber. Because despite what you may have heard, monospecific assemblages of vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates, are almost unknown, except in one species, ours. And the reason is we separate our dead from the environment. It's almost a universal truism of humans. It's almost one of our identifying features. And we were claiming that we had discovered the first clearly non-human species of hominid, of bipedal ape, that was also deliberately disposing of its dead. That did not please many people. They said it was impossible. They said it's a single occurrence. You can't make a claim like that on one occurrence. So we found another one, 110 meters away, in another chamber that we would call the Naledi chamber. We found this remarkable skeleton and 2 other individuals, except this time they're tucked into alcoves in the walls of the cave. Exactly the same anatomy. And I can tell you here that we've actually found more situations like that. This rising star cave system is full of these incredible creatures. And when we announced this remarkable skeleton, we also announced that we had finally got a date. After 11 different techniques, 5 different labs, double blind, we came up with the remarkable idea that Homo naledi was not 2 million years old, as it should be by its anatomy, or 3, but it was between 2 and 300,000 years old. Why is that remarkable? Because it kills a lot of sacred cows. We had thought that human evolution had worked in a progressive thing with ultimately larger brain hominids always replacing, perhaps driving to extinction, the models that went before them. At 2 to 300,000 years in Africa, we know by the archaeology that modern humans are arising there. All this early technology, even in southern Africa, is becoming more and more complex. It's a hallmark of this big brain and the evolving idea inside of the human mind that is modern human origins. But Homo naledi is sitting there in Africa with all those tools and archaeology around it, and almost no evidence of a large-brained hominid anywhere near. It was startling and disturbing. Had we got it wrong? Well, we now know that there are multiple species of hominids across the world at that time, some of them very odd. The Flores hobbits in Indonesia you might have heard of. Some of you may have heard just earlier this year the 350,000-year-old large-brained hominids at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. And Neanderthals are emerging at this time in Europe. What is Homo naledi? Well, the answer is we have no idea. We don't know where it fits into this picture. If it fits into our evolution, is it a kin of ours or is it part of us? I'm so glad we didn't find Homo naledi 10 or 15 years ago, because we're able to apply technologies to these fascinating questions about this extraordinary species that didn't exist. Technologies like these, this is LiDAR underground cave, and we can add that to augmented virtual reality, and we'll be releasing next year high-resolution augmented virtual reality so you can enter those chambers and explore them and discover in them in the way we are. We are able to look inside the heads of these skeletons with the highest resolution scanners down to 50 microns, pulling things out like the brains of these hominids, which impressed themselves on the inside of skulls. Extraordinary images that are telling us more about these creatures in the past, how they lived, how they thought. And we have seen Homo naledi's brain. And Homo naledi's brain is perhaps the most complex brain we have ever seen, outside of human brains and Neanderthal brains, yet packaged in this tiny package. Had they figured out how to get beyond some of those issues of an expensive brain tissue? We don't know, because we've not found Homo naledi outside of this occurrence. Homo naledi is going to lead us into a disruptive age of paleoanthropology. It sits out of time and place. My colleagues who guessed that that deposit was going to be 2 to 3 million years old weren't wrong. Homo naledi must have originated then. It's that primitive. But it remained invisible to us, coming down through time. Imagine that. We missed an entire complex species that must have existed for 2 or more million years. And then we found it. What does it mean for other things that we might have missed? And so, I had learned, I am a slow learner, but I had learned something from the Malapa experience in Australopithecus sediba. I had learned that sometimes we don't see the things that we think we know the best. Sometimes we don't see our own backyards. Sometimes we think the best discoveries are in these far off places that others haven't explored. And so we didn't stop exploring. And so the new maps of what the cave sites that we're looking out there are not in just the hundreds, but in the thousands. We have found over 250 fossil localities in the most explored area on planet Earth. 250 fossil localities other scientists hadn't seen. And they thought that the age of exploration in this field was over. We are also finding extraordinary new fossils. And I do not exaggerate when I say this. We are finding fossils like this. That is a block that is about 90 centimeters by 60 centimeters. And every bone you're looking at is a hominid bone. That block right this moment is in Lockheed Martin in Dallas, Texas, being scanned in a military micro CT scanner so that we can look inside of it. And we can see the remains of the bones that we know are there because we put it in a medical CT scanner. And what we're going to do with this, because we sit in this amazing moment of discovery, is we're going to leave that in there. And we're going to digitally prepare, using researchers from across the globe actually competing with artificial intelligence, to bring these bones from inside out, print them, and share them with other scientists and the public live as we do it over the next 6 months. And then we can preserve this material for future generations of scientists who may be able to do things with discoveries like this that we can't imagine now. And that's the place we are in. This story that I've told you has a number of messages deeply within it. One is that there's always a way to do something without destroying it. Some of you may be thinking, why didn't you just open that chute up, Lee, so you could happily walk in there with your non-physiologically appropriate body? The reason is because sometimes we do better things when we challenge ourselves as humans. Why would we jump to destruction when we can use technology and advanced technology and find extraordinary humans that can actually do this work? Extraordinary humans that can become inspiration for this and the next generation, who are true explorers at the front end of science, making discoveries, risking their lives, and bringing us information about ourselves. You know, I speak to audiences all over the world, many of them children. And something that deeply bothers me is that almost universally, particularly children will say, the age of exploration's over. That was the age of when people went out in ships to new lands and found new islands that weren't occupied, who climbed mountains for the first time, who went into deep jungles to make discoveries of lost civilizations. But those days are gone. If I go into this, all I'm going to do is just stand on the shoulder of these giants and make tiny contributions. I think many scientists in many fields think like this. I want you to take from this, though, that is a lie. It's a lie that we as humans have convinced yourselves. This story about the discovery of Sediba and Naledi tell us that's a lie. That first site was discovered in the most explored area on planet Earth for sites and objects like this, and it was so easy to do, a 9-year-old could do it. The second site, the Naledi chamber in the Rising Star Cave system, was inside of the most explored cave possibly on the continent of Africa, in a place that someone else had been that clearly had not recognized what extraordinary things were beneath their feet. They were not prepared for discovery. That is what we need to do. We need to use stories of science and exploration sciences like this to not only encourage, but to inspire this generation and the next that there are still things to be discovered. We must teach people how to be prepared for discovery. We must make them believe in discovery. We must teach children that you don't need to do extreme things to get on the pages of things like New Scientist. You don't need to climb the south side of Everest naked with a dead parrot on your shoulder to be a first. There are great discoveries right in front of us. We must build in ourselves, in humanity, and in our children the spirit of exploration, and we must never stop exploring. Thank you very much, everyone.
Let's say our hypothesis is right, that Homo naledi was deliberately disposing of its dead. Few people have realized that's probably 200,000 years before we even are suggesting humans do that level of behavior. That's incredible.
You talked about the second chamber when second lot of Naledi bones were found, and you said that you'd found they were tucked away in niches. So that's been published, has it?
Yes.
Yes. But you said, I can tell you now, we found more evidence of that.
Well, we found more evidence of Homo naledi.
Yeah.
So what has occurred is we've originally found the Naledi chamber,
Yeah.
which had that incredible number of fossils in
Yeah.
it. We then found the Naledi chamber, which is 110 meters away. It's the same species, exactly the same, but the situation is slightly different. The 3 individuals that we found in that chamber appear to be up in alcoves. Now, we don't know whether that's because a floor has been removed and that they are just by chance in there, or that they are actually in those alcoves. And that's what we're working on right now.
Okay.
And then we found multiple other occurrences of Homo naledi throughout the system. The last count that I have is over 24 individuals of Homo naledi, which is incredible if you think about that. And what's interesting about them is that they're all the same. They all look alike. They look just like each other. And so that's very unusual for hominids. If you think of hominids like the ones we discovered at Dmanisi, those hominids were very variable, even though they found 5 or 6 different individuals. Each one, some people said, were different species. These are all exactly the same. And that may mean either that Homo naledi was like that, or that this is what true populations of hominids look like, and that the other ones have been scattered over time, and maybe we aren't looking at actual populations of hominids. What we need, though, is another hominid species in this kind of number to actually figure that out.
As I understand it, Naledi is a weird mosaic of very ancient looking features and very modern looking features, and that might be because of interbreeding between a very modern and an ancient species. Is that right?
One idea could be hybridization, or it could be that this hominid descends from a very ancient ancestor that's maybe primitive to the entire genus. That is, could this be the stem of our genus? Now, that's a possibility, and then things like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, they spin off of this. Maybe even the hobbits in Flores spin off of this. But that doesn't explain a lot of the very advanced features we see in Homo naledi. There are features in Homo naledi that are only seen in modern humans and not seen in even things like Homo erectus. So how do we explain that? And the answer is we don't have an explanation for that right now. We're working on molecular studies, trying to get things like ancient DNA, proteins, and as you know, the science of proteomics is advancing very rapidly. We have high hopes for that. That may answer that question. One of the huge problems, which is a good problem to have, but it also is very difficult, is that Homo naledi is now one of the best represented hominids in the entire fossil record, probably outside of Neanderthals. And so to compare it to a very fragmentary record, that we're unsure whether all of those are the same species, they're often very variable. But if there's a Homo naledi there, with its mosaic of features across its body, some primitive, some very advanced, how would you recognize it if you only found small bits? How do we know there aren't other species like it or different from it that are constantly contaminating our record that we assumed was one record? And that makes paleoanthropology very difficult now, but I think also very exciting. It means we have to get back and look at old collections again, and we need to find new fossils, more fossils.
On the note of finding more fossils, I read your book. Unfortunately, I put it on Kindle edition, so I can't get you to sign it.
You can sign the front of your iPad.
I want to quote John Hawkes at the end. So you take him to a site that isn't Malepi, I think I've pronounced that right, Malapi,
yep.
And it isn't Rising Star, and you give him a block. He turns it over in his hands, I'm quoting here. 2 teeth caught my eye, I'm quoting him rather. The bone of the jaw that contained them was strong and robustly built. I glanced up at Lee, who simply stood watching me examine the ancient hominin jaw, an amused look on his face. I said what we were all thinking, here we go again. That was 2016. Now you get things done quickly. So what was that?
That's another hominid site we discovered.
Okay.
And that we are in the process of opening up. One of the things that happened to us in between that discovery and actually digging into it was a lot of other discoveries. We haven't stopped exploring. And when this all started, and I never dreamed something like this would happen back in 2008, you have to remember that you could go your entire life and never make one of these discoveries, not even a piece, not even a tooth. And yet now we're in this period where it's exploding, where we're finding that these things are not as rare as we thought. We were often just looking in the wrong places, or for some reason we were looking with the wrong eyes. And so now we have multitudes of discoveries, multitudes of early hominid discoveries at different sites. A lot of them are very difficult to work. They are sites like the more traditional sites, so the material is embedded in very hard rock. A lot of them are, we're just waiting for the right young scientists to come along that we funnel in to do that. Field work is both very difficult, very time consuming, and very expensive. And so building those groups around that. That site people are fairly familiar that we have a major another hominid discovery. That's not a That's not a secret amongst the community of paleoanthropologists. It's just in a very, very difficult and very unsafe situation.
So you have another major hominin discovery.
Yes.
A new species.
I don't know yet.
You don't know if it's a new species.
It's not. I will tell you this. I can tell you this very early on.
Yeah.
What we're looking at is not Sediba, and it's not Naledi.
Could it be, is it robustus? Could it be any of the
It could be. It maybe. I don't know. We haven't got them out of the rock yet. As I said, the situation they're in is very different from any other situation that we've made a discovery like this. And so it's a very dangerous situation. So we're still working out how to stabilize that situation before we actually extract them. So all I have is a glimpse of several of the individuals, and that they are not very tiny. John alluded to that in talking about a robust mandible.
And so that jumble of bones that you showed in your talk, where's that from?
So that is the remains of Carabo, the holotype of Australopithecus sediba. Australopithecus sediba is the fossil hominid from Malapa. When we originally found the first specimen, that was a skeleton, we actually ran a competition for children in South Africa to name it, and they named that skeleton Carabo. And it was in and of itself one of the most complete hominid skeletons ever discovered, more complete than Lucy, as complete as some of the best fossils that's ever been discovered. We found those other remains from the site. My wife was doing her PhD. She's a radiologist, but also was doing a PhD in paleoanthropology on pioneering CT scanning of blocks. And in scanning a very large block at a medical CT scanner, we made a discovery. We discovered that the block was full of skeletal remains of a hominid. And so for the last couple of years, we've been preparing this large block down to reach the first layer of hominids, but we know there's more material there. Now we don't know if that material is the remains of Carabo or if there's another hominid skeleton lying underneath it. And we've just delivered that block to Lockheed Martin in Dallas, Texas, and it is being CT scanned with a custom CT scanner that's usually used to scan things like missiles and engines, and it's being scanned at very high resolution as we speak.
And that's 2 million years old.
1.977 plus or minus 1,500 years.
Talking of new technologies, so Naledi, say 200,000 years old in a cave, that's a prime candidate for having DNA and protein signatures.
Absolutely.
So what's happening on that front?
So we tried a first round of ancient DNA extraction using bone, which failed, but that's not to say it's not going to succeed. Ancient DNA is advancing almost at the speed that Moore's law is, and and those were only bones that were kind of randomly selected. We also know there are other types of bones, other areas of anatomy that can give us extraordinary results. We were sort of waiting for that technology to mature and also to discover more and other specimens so that we could select different types of preservation. We have not run proteins yet, but will. And of course, proteomics is the new aDNA. And I have high hopes for ancient proteins in that material. It's of course well within the grasp of ancient proteins, and given that these bones don't even look like fossils, they hardly look fossilized, I think there's a very good chance. I wouldn't bet against within the next 5 years or so that you hear about ancient DNA and or proteins out of Homo naledi, and when we do, that's going to be very exciting because it will answer the questions that we all have. Is Homo naledi related to us? Is Homo naledi that elusive species X that interbred with modern humans in Africa around 200,000 years ago? Is Homo naledi another thing that is related to us and not species X? And how is it related to us? Is Homo naledi not related to us at all? That would almost be more remarkable. And yet Homo naledi is so primitive, it would be remarkable. There's no answer that's not going to be striking within that. Now we do know there are large brain hominids in Africa, at least in the very north of Africa in Morocco, Jebel Hood, at 350,000 years. And we know that the date on Naledi is about 230,000 to 330,000 years. We don't have a very precise date on that. So we know that large brain hominids and Homo naledi coexisted on the continent. But did Homo naledi ever meet Homo sapiens, or maybe more appropriately, did Homo sapiens ever meet Homo naledi? And if so, what happened? We don't have an answer for that yet.
Well, every time modern humans appear on the scene, other species seem to disappear of humans and hominins and other animals. Could it, I mean, one hypothesis is maybe modern humans brought about the demise of Naledi.
That, of course, is a possibility. I would just point out, though, that with new DNA studies, what we're finding out is they don't all disappear. And there's almost always some small introgression of DNA that gets captured by Homo sapiens. And maybe that's our trick. Maybe we just keep breeding ourselves into the better mousetrap, as well as being not such a friendly encounter for other species. Remember this, and this is really hard, and I think even paleoanthropologists often have a hard time getting their minds around this. We know that there were earlier populations of Homo naledi. We just don't know how early they go. It almost certainly wasn't the last occurrence of Homo naledi. When did a thing like Homo naledi go extinct? A lot of times everyone has a picture in their mind that every time there's a new evolutionary development in our story, that we wipe out the previous story. But that's not the way biology works. It's not the way evolution works. It's simply human arrogance, and even scientists today propagate it. The only thing we absolutely know is that we're alone today. But when did that alone happen? It probably wasn't very long ago. Probably most species that existed in the past existed for much longer than we have previously given them credit to. We know for sure that in the last couple of 100,000 years that humans have had the input of at least 3 extinct species, and likely more into our DNA.
DNA analysis has shown there's a mystery human X that
Yep.
bred for us.
Well, there's Denisovans.
Yeah.
They've intergressed with people in Indonesia, some people in Asia, and then there are Neanderthals, and they've intergressed a little bit with people in Europe, Asia, China. Then there's a species X that exists in Africa, but we don't know what it is. We just can see the markers there, and it's suggested it occurs around 200,000 to 300,000 years. And you do have Homo naledi there, 200,000 to 300,000 years. And if I were trying to be a sort of arrogant scientist and claim, a place for this, for Homo naledi, I'd say, well, there you go, you've got Homo naledi. But Homo naledi also has another message of caution for us. If it could hide from us, if it could remain invisible from us for likely millions of years, as it existed in parallel to all these other things we're finding, other things could too. There's more out there to find.
So what about the possible links between my pronunciation is probably on Floresiensis, and that's very small, primitive yet modern human being, lived very recently. Do you think there could be a link?
So I think that we have 2 possible links for Floresiensis. I think Sediba is not a bad candidate ancestral species for that. We've said that before in papers. Floresiensis has some things that are primitive to Homo naledi, and or they're very derived in a very odd manner because they are not like anything, like the foot and the wrist morphology. But and Homo naledi has very advanced feet and wrists. Sediba might be a better kind of candidate for that. A early Homo naledi could. I think what we're pretty sure is that Floresiensis doesn't come out of Homo erectus.
Okay.
And so you need it to come from something that is as primitive as Flores or as primitive as Naledi or something else.
So we've got these amazing symbolic discoveries in in South Africa.
Yeah.
We've got the etched ochre, we've got etched shells, and we assumed they were the product of our big-brained Homo sapiens. You're saying...
I'm saying that one of the truly disruptive things that archaeologists now have to face about Homo naledi is a very clear one. You've got to have the evidence to make your argument. And we have been assuming that there were only large-brained hominids in Africa in the last 500,000, 600,000 or so years. Suddenly, we have found a small-brained hominid that's primitive, that's not a human, not anything like one of those large-brained hominids. And it's sitting right there in the middle of southern Africa. Around it is a plethora of archaeology that we call the early Middle Stone Age, that almost every archaeologist, from those working at Pinnacle Point to Wonderwerk Cave to the coast of South Africa, other coastal sites in South Africa, say that industry is the origins of what will be the complex next stage of the origins of modern human, that's going to lead into this explosion that's happening after 200,000 years in symbolic behavior, in complexity, the invention of what I've often called the infinite toolkit. What if we got that narrative wrong? What if Homo naledi is doing all that? Now, probably a lot of archaeologists, the moment I say something like that, will go puce and grab their heart and say, but we know modern humans did that. And my colleagues and I say, well, show us the evidence. We've already claimed that this is a site of deliberate body disposal. What I think a lot of people may not really understand is, if that's true, then Homo naledi is already operating at a level that we're not claiming for Homo sapiens for another 200,000 years. It's already operating at a level that borders on the symbolic, likely. And we studied the endocast of the brain and published that and said that Homo naledi has one of the most complex brains we've ever seen. It's got a large Broca's area in the areas of speech. It's bilaterally asymmetrical. It's got a lot of complexity that we've only ever seen in brains the size of humans. What if Homo naledi actually had cracked that code of how to be smart with a small brain? You know, humans are just now finding out that we've been wrong about almost everything we thought about the neural capacity of other animals. I mean, bird brains, which are tiny, operate in a very different way, and they are extraordinarily complex. We're seeing that with the study of octopus. Let's say our hypothesis is right. Let's say our hypothesis is right that Homo naledi was deliberately disposing of its dead, maybe in varying complex ways, like we see in the Denelay chamber, like we see in the Lassetti chamber. Yeah. Few people have realized that's probably 200,000 years before we even are suggesting humans do that level of behavior. That's incredible, if it's true.
The fact that there were appear to be two different types of disposal, one putting it down a chute, one putting it in little niches. So there's not just, you've got two. Have you got any more than that?
We have those kind of two types, and there may be other evidence we're working on right now.
Okay, can you tell me about that?
Nope.
Okay, so you do have other evidence, but you can't talk about it.
The very fact that during the expedition itself, only hominids were coming in. I was a vertebrate paleontologist by training as an undergrad, and you know, I've studied animals all over the world, and I know what zoologists and paleontologists mean when they say monospecific assemblages. They're never monospecific. You talk about a wildebeest drowning site or a bison jump site or whatever is a monospecific thing. There's always other stuff. There's either the stuff in the catchment area. They're there with fish bones and crocodile bones and all this other stuff. Or there's zebra in the middle of it, but only a few. Or, you know, there's always other stuff. There was no other stuff. They were alone. And they're really invertebrate, terrestrial vertebrate mammals. That's so rare as to be almost unheard of, and yet completely common. And it's completely common in humans. Why? Because we spend all our time trying to explain why we're separate from nature. And so did our ancestors. And all of them did it in the past. They saw themselves as separate from nature and separated. They didn't want bodies undergoing those natural processes for whatever reasons. And that does vary, but it's almost a universal truism in human behavior into the relatively deep past where we know they're humans. So if it's true in Homo naledi, then it's astounding.
So you've got the initial cave you found with lots of bones, and then in the next cave you've got what appear to be cached in niches.
They are in holes in the walls.
Holes in the wall, okay. And you've got something else which you can't
We
talk
have
about.
other sites with Homo naledi, and I have something else I can't talk about.
To do with Homo naledi?
Yes.
To do with its disposal?
I'm not going to go there. We are going to talk about some relationships based on discoveries we've made. I mean relationships with other species, and we are also, we have other sites.
So other sites with possibly other human species in them?
Yes, either known or unknown, yeah.
An unknown. So relationships, how are you? I'm
not going to tell you.
So you have got evidence of there is relationships.
We believe we have
between
strong
what and what?
evidence of at least a relationship with Homo naledi. And that will be big news.
Well, thank you very,
My
very much
absolute
for talking to
pleasure.
me. I never got round to any of the basic stuff. But anyway, okay, thank you
Yes,
ever so
of
much.
course.
It's such a delight talking
My
to you.
pleasure.
From rituals in deep caves to stone tools, the next great leap in human evolution wasn't physical, it was cultural. What makes us human isn't just flesh and bone. We have culture, symbolism, and imagination. But when did these traits first come about? For example, when did early humans first start caring about what they wore?
About 30,000 years ago, people definitely had needles. So we know that there are bone needles. So we know that they're going to be sewing their clothes. So that gives you a big clue as to what those clothes might have been like. And also, there's probably some weaving as well.
How do you know about things like what people wore and how they made their houses? Wouldn't clothes and tents have rotted away by now?
That's a great question. Yeah, so most things that are made out of organic materials, and that means kind of anything that's made out of cloth or leather or wood or grasses, most of that will have rotted away, and so we don't get it archaeologically. So archaeologically we're just left with the hard things, which might be things made of stone, bone, antler, that kind of thing, shells. So we do have to do a bit of imagining. But if we have, for instance, a burial where somebody has been laid in the grave, and all that we've got then are the bones and then the hard objects that were buried with them, we might be able to see, for instance, that there's maybe a row of teeth that have been pierced to make them into pendants, and they're kind of sitting up around the neck. So you think, okay, I haven't got the string that these were on, but that's clearly a necklace.
Yeah.
And the same with, if there's lots of ivory beads in particular places, then maybe those were sewn onto clothes. So we get clues like that. And sometimes there's really, really kind of amazing clues, like there's a particular imprint of a bit of woven cloth. So we don't have any woven fabric from that long ago. But there is this little imprint, which I think is from the Czech Republic. And it's from somebody who's knelt on a bit of mud, a bit of clay, and they were obviously wearing something which was woven cloth, because you've got the imprint of the woven cloth. So even though we don't have the woven cloth and that hasn't survived, we've got an imprint of it. And so we've got that amazing, I love that there's these little clues that you can draw on.
In the history of humans, there was no cultural leap more important or mysterious than language. Some even say it was the defining moment for who we are today. And language isn't just communication. It's transmission of knowledge, cumulative culture, and the ability to imagine together. And by looking back in our history, we might be able to see how it developed.
We have a direct connection to all the other great apes that share the planet with us. We tend to think of ourselves as special with unique capabilities that are different from other animals, but in reality, everything that we do, all of our behaviors, all of our brain functions, our memory processes, our language processes have come about through evolution, and we share many of those capabilities with other animal species. There's no way to understand who we are as great apes without understanding all of our cousins here. As humans, we think we've got these really unique communication skills, our language skills. But we know that we didn't always have language, and it had to emerge out of something else. What were those precursor behaviors? What were the behaviors that helped us build a language system over evolutionary time? One of the things that we can't do is look at how they came about, because none of our ancient ancestors are still alive. But about 6 million years ago, we shared a common ancestor, chimpanzees and gorillas. And that means that we will all have inherited similar kinds of brains and bodies and behaviors. Understanding what we've shared allows us to understand our own evolutionary journey. We have this theory that how we use our hands, how we make and use tools, lays the groundwork in the brain for how we use and make language. Two behaviors that might look really different on the surface might actually be powered by a similar set of brain processes. And so our study is looking at how those two things are related. For this experiment, we've created a set of puzzle boxes to look at how different ape species use their hands to solve problems. Different kinds of boxes test different kinds of problem-solving skills. So this is the easiest one. This is the flat maze. And as you can see, all you have to do is maneuver the nut through the box. This is one of the more difficult puzzle boxes. So it's got a bit of flat maze, but it also has cogs. So that takes a little bit more abstraction, something that has a developmental timeline. So babies won't maybe make these sorts of connections, but as children and apes grow and work with the physical world around them and understand cause and effect, then they might work this one out. It's kind of like putting the words together that form a sentence and getting the goal out the bottom, which is the meaning. So we've tried out our boxes now on great ape species, including orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees. These guys here have all had a go on the boxes. And now we're trying it out on the other great ape species, us humans. When a baby is born, they've got a predisposition for developing language, but they don't have language already. They have to develop it. And what we see happening and unfolding is this parallel between how they're using their hands, manipulating objects, starting to use tools, and how they learn and develop their speech.
It's like, I'm sitting.
In the future, we may be able to use motor development as a risk marker for language disorders. So understanding both typical development and atypical development, the earlier we can see that something might be deviating from the typical track, this would then allow us to innovate new kinds of interventions, new kinds of therapies, with a new understanding of how the brain develops. Then we can start looking at how to help individuals much earlier. So the primary objective would be that early on, if we see that motor development isn't unfolding typically, by getting in there really early and strengthening those motor capabilities, we're hoping that we'll see a benefit to the language development for those children.
From our most ancient ancestors to cutting-edge science, it's time to look at how new tools aren't just filling in gaps in our knowledge, they're overturning entire assumptions. Up next, we look at the current research at the forefront of building up the entire human family tree and the hunt for the so-called Ancestor X.
In many ways, we've been a lucky species. And I think if we went back 100,000 years, there were 4 or 5 different kinds of humans around on the Earth. It might be difficult to pick any one of them out and say, these are the ones who are going to be successful and end up taking over the world, and the others are all going to disappear. When we look, for example, at Britain, over the last 900,000 years, it looks like there were probably at least 12 separate occupations of the British Isles by humans. Probably 4 different species were here. All of those earlier occupations, 11 of them at least, disappeared because of severe climate change. If we need a more global explanation for why we're the last ones, we've got to talk about why Denisovans disappeared, why Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, disappeared, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. I think luck is certainly part of it, and I think we don't necessarily know the full story. Obviously, if you're going to survive, you have to have enough population numbers, you have to have enough genetic diversity to see you through crises. These earlier species, they've got a larger physiological load, they probably were more demanding of the environment in terms of the calories, and that means that in any given environment, actually you can support less people. To begin with, of course, Homo sapiens spread out of Africa in very small numbers, and many of those early populations of Homo sapiens, we think they died out too. So Homo sapiens wasn't guaranteed to have success. Who knows what the future holds? I don't think we've got any guarantees of long-term success, even for Homo sapiens. We'll have to see. Scientific technological change has obviously had a huge impact on human evolution and our studies of human evolution. When we're looking at recent forms, of course, we've got their DNA, we've got their external morphology, coloration, really detailed knowledge of where they live, how they interact with other species. When we go further back in time, of course, material's less complete. But in the future, we'll have new techniques coming online. And at the moment, many of us are hopeful that proteomics will have an impact on the field. So one of the problems with DNA, of course, is that through time, of course, DNA decays. And once you're back more than 100,000 years, it gets very difficult to find any DNA surviving, even in the best environments. Denisova Cave is exceptional because there we've got DNA going back a couple of 100,000 years of the Denisovans, but in places like Africa, in tropical and subtropical environments, of course, it rarely preserves with any time depth. So people are looking at fossil proteins, and proteins survive better through time. Of course, there's less information in those fossil proteins, but hopefully, if that's successful, we will start to build up a network of relationships, just as we have with the DNA for us and the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Perhaps we'll eventually be able to build up a protein relationship network, not only for Denisovans and sapiens and us, but also for Heidelbergensis, for some of these earlier species, Homo antecessor and so on. Let's hope that works, because we need all the help we can get when we get back beyond a couple of 100,000 years. And it also solves some long-lasting problems, such as Homo floresiensis. Is that a dwarfed form of Homo erectus, or is it something much more primitive and evolved from a pre-human stage? The proteins, if they're preserved in floresiensis, could help us, and Homo luzonensis too. Homo naledi, of course, this puzzling species from southern Africa, about 300,000 years old, shows a very strange mixture of human and non-human characteristics. So it would be great to get proteomic data from Homo naledi to see where it really falls. Another technical advance, which has just come up in the last few years, and I'm sure will become more important, is the fact that it's now possible to recover DNA from cave sediments. So we know, of course, that the Neanderthals and the Denisovans range much more widely than the fossils we have indicate. So there are big areas, for example, of Asia, where we have stone tools and we don't actually know who made them, which species made them. So in the cave sediments, where those tools are, there may be remains from human DNA. The makers of those tools could have left their DNA behind. Maybe they died in the cave and their bones have disappeared, but the DNA is still there. Perhaps they just urinated in the cave. Maybe a woman gave birth in the cave, and that will have left DNA traces. If those could be picked up, we'll be able to map much more accurately the range of these ancient species, how they overlapped, where they came together and overlapped. And we know Denisovans and Neanderthals were overlapping at times in Siberia. So we'll be able to map that much more precisely if we have cave DNA. And then when we push even further back, the origin of the genus Homo, we don't really know when and where our genus originated. We don't know the ancestor for our genus. And pushing it back even further, when did the whole human line, the hominin line, originate? Geneticists estimate it could have been 7 million years ago, that we shared a common ancestor with our closest living relatives today, the chimpanzees. But have we fossils that actually represent that early evolution? There are ones from Africa which some people believe are on the human line, but I don't think it's clear yet that they really are on the human line. They could be, but equally, there must be ancestors, of course, for chimpanzees out there somewhere and for gorillas out there somewhere. And we know about the diversity in the last couple of million years. Maybe there was also diversity, 5 to 7 million years ago, and many of those were branches that ultimately failed. Perhaps we haven't even found the earliest members of the human lineage yet, and that would be exciting if we can identify them.
This skull changes everything we know about who we are, where we came from, and who we should call our closest relatives. Today, there's only one species of human, but did you know tens of thousands of years ago, there were 9 other incredible species that roamed the Earth? These are some of the remains that scientists have discovered. And with this discovery, one question has been nagging away at the back of our minds. How are we all related? Well, this skull might hold the answer.
I'm working with Chinese colleagues on studying really interesting fossils from China, which I think will have a big impact on this story of our origins, the origins of the Neanderthals, and the origins of the Denisovans.
It comes from an ancient human that's more closely related to us than any other species, and it might change everything we know about human evolution. Where did we come from? It's one of the most fundamental questions we ask ourselves. Every year, scientists get closer to discovering this answer. They dig up hundreds of ancient human fossils annually. Take a look at these fossils discovered in Africa. They're nearly 4 million years old, and they have a list of incredibly odd features. Long arms like an orangutan, gripping toes like a chimpanzee, and long legs like us. As the millennia passed, evolution gradually turned those ancestors into creatures that looked a little more like us. Let me introduce you to Lucy, one of the most famous fossils ever discovered. Lucy walked a fine line between ape and human, upright, curious, and on the brink of something new. And by about 2.5 million years ago, humans had appeared in Africa, but those first humans weren't members of our species. In fact, one of the greatest discoveries of the 21st century is that the human family tree is far more tangled and diverse than we could have imagined. This means that by the time our species did appear, about 315,000 years ago, it shared the world with as many as 5 other human species. Let me tell you all about them quickly. On the Indonesian island of Flores, there was a species of unusually short humans known as Homo floresiensis. This species is sometimes nicknamed the Hobbit. Just 2,500 kilometers to the north, in the Philippines, there lived another species known as Homo luzonensis. They had curved finger and toe bones, hinting that they might have been one of the last humans able to climb trees as easily as they walked on the ground. Across in Europe, meanwhile, there were the familiar Neanderthals, with heavily built bodies and prominent bony ridges above their eyes. In southern Africa, there were odd, almost ape-like humans known as Homo Naledi. Some scientists think that this species developed complex burial rituals, despite having a relatively small brain. And all across Africa and Eurasia, there were small populations of Homo erectus, an ancient species that had first appeared on Earth about 2 million years ago and was still present on our planet as recently as 110,000 years ago. To this day, scientists argue about exactly how these species relate to one another. But one central idea has rarely been questioned. Most scientists suspect that among all these ancient humans, it was the Neanderthals who were our closest relatives. About 15 years ago, we learned just how closely related the Neanderthals were to our ancestors. Using new tools to read DNA trapped inside ancient human bones, scientists began studying the Neanderthal genome. they found clear evidence that Neanderthals and our ancestors interbred with each other. In fact, even today, most of us carry some Neanderthal DNA in our bodies, left over from this interbreeding. The DNA also suggested that Neanderthals and modern humans both shared a common ancestor about 500,000 to 700,000 years ago. We don't know the exact identity of that ancient human species, so it's sometimes known simply as Ancestor X. So, where exactly does this skull fit into the story? And why does it change everything we know? When scientists began reading the DNA locked away in ancient human bones, they found something unexpected. In a tiny finger bone and a few teeth, all dug up at Denisova cave in southern Siberia, they found DNA that didn't match any they had seen before. It didn't belong to a Neanderthal, and it didn't belong to one of our modern human ancestors. Eventually, the scientists worked out how to explain this unusual DNA. They said it belonged to a mysterious group of ancient humans who were closely related to the Neanderthals. That meant they had to redraw our family tree. They argued that after Ancestor X gave rise to the Neanderthal group and the modern human group, the Neanderthal group quickly split again. One branch led to the familiar Neanderthals, and the other led to the enigmatic humans from the Denisova cave. The scientists even gave these humans a name, the Denisovans. But the Denisovans were still very mysterious. Think back to those other ancient human species we met earlier. Homo floresiensis from Indonesia, Homo naledi from southern Africa, and so on. We know quite a lot about all these species because scientists have unearthed plenty of fossil bones and even some almost complete skeletons belonging to them. For the Denisovans, scientists had a few tiny fossils that would comfortably fit in the palm of your hand. Things began to change in 2019 when experts confirmed that a jawbone found in Baishia Karst Cave, which is on the Tibetan Plateau, contained Denisovan protein molecules. Then, earlier this year, scientists pulled off a similar trick with this skull. It has just one tooth still attached, and when scientists scraped some of the plaque off the tooth and analyzed it, they found traces of Denisovan DNA. For the first time, scientists could actually stare a Denisovan in the face. But what do we know about this skull, and how does it relate to us? Well, appropriately enough for a mysterious Denisovan, its discovery is also something of a mystery. The official story is that it was found by a laborer working near Harbin in northeast China in the 1930s. The laborer is said to have hidden the skull in the bottom of a well for decades, only revealing the secret of its existence to his family shortly before he died. His family recovered the skull and handed it over to scientists in 2018. Those scientists then ran some tests, and in 2021...
I was on that Dragon Man paper that created Homo longi, and we're pretty sure that's a Denisovan.
Concluded the skull is about 146,000 years old. They also looked closely at the skull's shape and appearance. In their 2021 study, they argued that the skull didn't look like a modern human or a Neanderthal. They actually placed it in a new species, which they named Homo longi, which means dragon man. So, with this year's news that this skull is associated with Denisovan DNA, it looks like we can finally give the Denisovans a proper species name. It seems that the Denisovans belong to the species Homo longi. But the scientists weren't finished yet. By comparing the shape of this skull with the shape of dozens of other ancient human skulls, they constructed a new human family tree, and this one looks very different. It suggests that many of the ancient human fossils from the past 500,000 years fall into three large groups. One of these groups corresponds with the Neanderthals, one with modern humans like us, and the third includes this skull and some others. It's a Denisovan group, or giving it a scientific name, a Homo longi group. What's even more shocking? We've always known Neanderthals to be our closest ancestors, but this new skull discovery reveals that the Denisovans are actually more closely related to modern humans than the Neanderthal group. And if that's the case, Ancestor X changes too. It's worth saying that all of these ideas are so new that scientists haven't had much of a chance to debate and further test them yet. But if that way of thinking is right, then this skull is three things at the same time. It's a Denisovan skull, it belongs to the species Homo longi, and it represents the ancient humans most closely related to our own species. But if the Denisovans really were our closest relatives, what do we actually know about the way they lived? Well, the short answer is not very much. Yet, to really understand the lives of the Denisovans, we'll need to study the tools and other artifacts they made, which we can only do when we find archaeological sites where they lived. So far, scientists have only found 2 of those sites. One is the Denisova cave itself, where archaeologists have found hundreds of stone tools as well as some spectacular jewelry. But the Denisova cave is unusual. Sometimes it was occupied by Denisovans, sometimes by Neanderthals, and sometimes by modern humans. So we can't say for sure which group made the jewelry. This is why Baishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau is so important. As far as archaeologists can tell, Denisovans were the only humans who lived here. So any artifacts they find in the cave must have been used and left by the Denisovans. Excavations have barely begun, but already they suggest that the Denisovans built fires in the cave, as well as venturing out onto the Tibetan plateau to hunt an amazing range of animals, including sheep, snow leopards, birds, and rodents. From cut marks left on some of those animal bones, it also looks like the Denisovans stripped the animals of their skins, perhaps turning them into clothes. Now, this might seem to be exactly the way ancient humans from the Stone Age should behave, living in caves and hunting wild animals for their meat and fur. But there's something about the Baishia Karst cave that doesn't fit with our expectations of ancient human behavior. Its location. Baishia Karst cave lies about 3,200 meters above sea level. Life at that altitude can be tough. Some of the archaeologists who have visited the cave have complained that the thin air gives them headaches. Why would one group of Denisovans have decided to move into such a challenging environment? Well, they probably didn't have to. There weren't that many humans on Earth in the Stone Age, so it's unlikely anyone was forced to climb onto the Tibetan plateau just to find some space to call their own. In fact, we still don't know why one group of Denisovans made this journey, but some archaeologists think they were driven by simple human curiosity to explore. If the Denisovans really were our closest relatives, curiosity is just the sort of character trait we might expect to share with them.
So why are we here, and what happened to all those other species? Why did they disappear? That's one of the really big questions. But of course, when we go back in time, we've got this question of what originated the Homo sapiens lineage, what began our evolution, even what continent did it happen on.
It's amazing how much mystery a single skull can hold, containing entire lives, stories, and questions about where we came from.
Our family tree is still unfinished, and our origins are still unfolding. The deeper we look, the more complex and interconnected the story becomes. We hope this video has provided you an insight into the science of human origins. Thank you for watching, and if you like this, why not check out our video on the science of the mysterious orca boat attacks.